You are the world's fastest gamer, multiple world record holder in F1 eSports, and as of this last year, a real-life GT3 driver. You just completed your very first championship with Jenson Team Rocket, the British GT, finishing at a very respectable 4th place on the drivers' standings. Mr. James Baldwin, welcome to the channel. How are you, and have you actually had the time to really take in the enormity of this year yet?
And thank you for having me on your channel. It's a pleasure. I've seen one of your videos, which is fully based on me, and it was a great video. Subbed straight away, of course. And you know what? I haven't fully reflected on the year just yet because it's still ongoing. I've still got one round of F1 eSports to go with McLaren Shadow. But you're right. It's been not a great year for the world as a general rule of thumb, but for me, it's been a pretty mental year.
I would say mental is definitely an understatement for what you've gone through this year. So my props for getting through the year in one piece, and it's really good to have you on the program. Would you believe that I was in a practice server with your boss last night?
JB?
Yeah. I was practicing for there was a Spa 3-hour endurance event coming up. This will be in the past for the people watching this now, but Mr. Button joined us in an LMP2, casually cruising around Spa-Francorchamps.
Yeah, rFactor 2.
Yeah, rFactor 2.
Yeah, I saw he was practicing for that. So, oh, that's cool. Were you quicker than him, or?
Well, I'm in the GTE, so I can just feign ignorance and say we don't know. So, yeah, could go anyway. Could be some random YouTube guy, or could be the 2009 F1 World Champion that's the quickest. Who knows? So don't tell me you're doing the driver swap with him, please.
No. I can, I'll tell you that. But to be fair, rFactor 2, I have not played rFactor 2 in a long time. Probably March, something like that. So the thing is with Jenson as well, he's so quick on a sim, for a real driver. I know it's probably quite weird to say that, but a lot of them aren't. So I mean, he honestly on ACC especially, he's rapid.
I would believe that 100%. I mean, he's certainly seemed to know what he was doing. I think he set the quickest pace lap out of anyone within about 5 minutes of joining the server, so that was pretty good. So that segues pretty well into my next question. So, I mean, Jenson obviously puts a lot of stock in the sim racing community, as evidenced by giving you such a high-level drive the moment you won World's Fastest Gamer. Do you think we'll be seeing a lot more of that sort of thing happening in the future?
It's, I think, definitely. I think is the way to answer that question. But I think, first of all, World's Fastest Gamer provides a life-changing opportunity for myself, but I think, hopefully in the future as well. I think there's rumours of them doing another series going forward. I think they're not the first of their kind. I think GT Academy, who actually are run by the same guys back in the day, did that same thing as well with Jan Mardenborough, Lucas Ordonez. And naturally, I think there's going to be other competitions popping up in the future doing that same thing. Obviously, don't know the name of them because they're not formed yet. But it's a narrative with racing esports, which I think is really, really cool and interesting because not other esports can't do it. But I'm just thankful I was able to be one of those stories. And there's some exceptional talent out there at sim racing, so I think you're going to see more and more of it.
Do you feel like as time goes on and we invariably bridge the talents from sim racing with the real world motorsports scene, do you think we're going to see just an escalation of the level of quality that we see in real life motorsports as the aliens that may not have had the financial or economic means to get a hold of real life motorsports start to slowly trickle into that scene? Do you think that they'll essentially enrich real life motorsport?
It's going to take time. We both know that motorsport's changing. It's going fully electric. One day it will be. Sim racing's changing because it's on the rise. It's constantly having new games come out, and it's still finding itself and finding its feet. But there's no doubt that the talent in sim racing is there in massive depth. I think you're going to see people doing what I've done, doing more than I've done. I plan on hopefully doing more, but there's really some exceptional talent out there on all of the games. Whether the game's realistic or not, it doesn't really take away the fact that someone has the talent to be a quick driver. They just need that opportunity and that backing, really. And World's Fastest Gamer have given me that backing. It's a weird topic because, like other people in motorsport, sim racers are obviously limited by the fact they need money to get into it, whether that be for a program or their own money. So there might be a wealthy sim racer out there that's really, really fast that might just go one day, you know what, I'm going to try it in the real world. And you might see a journey like that.
For me, this is a whole new world. I've just jumped into competitive racing in rFactor very recently, and to see the level of pace that these guys are at. Like if you're like me, you're just kind of a casual motorsports fan, you'll look at like the 24 hours of Spa, the 24 hours of Nürburgring onboards, and you feel like you've learned all the break points, you've learned all the gearing, you've learned basically how to exit a corner, how to trail brake in, and you've got like a 1-to-1 performance ratio with all of your favorite real-world drivers, and you're like, I'm ready for this. Then you jump in with the aliens and you get absolutely obliterated. Like I think they were lapping like 6 seconds faster than I was, if not up to 10 on the N24, the full endurance layout. And I'm just like, where do you find a 10th per corner? So it's just amazing to see the level of talent that's out there, and it's given me a greater degree of reverence, I think, and respect for the kids that really put everything into this. So again, my respect and props to you for excelling at both levels now. I'm very curious to see where you go with the real life motorsport. But I guess we'll circle around back to that a little bit later. I actually have the most important question of this interview waiting for you right here.
Oh, okay.
Do you play as yourself in ACC?
Yeah, I'm not even ashamed to say it, but I do, and there's a good reason for that, because obviously the car is the car I like to drive, but in the game I've worked with the devs at ACC, and basically I've got them to implement my suit and my helmet into the game. So when I'm in VR practicing, I look down at my body and I'm wearing the actual suit I wear in real life, which it always trips me out, but it's so cool.
Do you ever hit up Aris on Facebook and go, hey man, just slightly tweak the BOP on the 720S. Just give us like an extra second at Brands Hatch.
Unfortunately I can't do that, but the BOP in general, even in real life, it's everything. Like it's something that's really interesting. And when it's on your side, you're like, this is great. But when you're up against it, it's like you wish it didn't exist, because you just wish everyone was in the same car. But it's part of it. I think maybe it needs to be explained better to viewers on how it works, because some people just tune in sometimes to see a Lamborghini running at the front, and they're like, well, last week the Lamborghini wasn't anywhere near that quick. What's going on? But it's GT racing. It's been part of it for ages. It's going to be going forward. And as you say, if you're on the right side of it, it's great.
Speaking of which, how do you feel about the role of things such as success penalties in the GT Championship?
It's hard to follow from a spectator point of view, isn't it? But
as someone that spectated every race that you were in, I just could not follow what was going on. I mean, there's already so much happening because you're not aware of what the pit strategies are as the viewer. You don't know, like, whether you're going in, whether you're coming out, where you actually are on the standings. Like, you may be in 15th, but you may actually be in second, and we just don't know unless the commentators decide to kind of average that all out for us and actually give us the race strategies. So, combine that with the success penalties, there's another layer of not understanding.
Yeah, I think there's an element of these championships are quite complicated, and that's fine. But maybe they need to look at the way they broadcast it to get that across to the viewer. F1 has these graphics that come up on the screen now. I know they're a bit of a meme, but some of them do help. And I think if there was similar stuff for the British GT or the GT World Challenge streams, that could help. And I think it would get more viewers onto that particular discipline of motorsport.
I completely agree with you, and I've broached the same topic with the viewers a few times, and you have the hardliners who are like, no, if people don't understand it, they don't deserve to be watching this and all that sort of stuff.
That's ridiculous.
I don't think that's a good way to open up a motorsport to the general public, and I think you should always be vying to make it more and more accessible, and F1 is a really good example, I guess, of how you can make a high-level motorsport discipline somewhat relatable to the average person or engaging to the average person. Now, obviously, GT racing is always going to be a little bit more tricky because you have multi-class, you've got the GT4s on the field as well as the GT3s, you've got like the Silver Cup and the AM and the Pro-Am and all of these subdivisions, but so long as the graphics, I think, on the screen are able to showcase what's happening in each subdivision, it gives people something a little bit more visceral to latch onto rather than just watching a nebulous shot of cars going around a track and trying to estimate based on what the commentators may be talking about at that point in time, what's actually happening with the race.
Yeah, I think from a driver point of view and a team point of view, it's great having all these spin-off regulations and whatever, because it makes you think, brings strategy into it. It's really interesting. Whereas for a viewer, if it was so plain sailing where it was simply the cars start the race, they finish the race, whoever finishes first, that's it. It would be quite boring. I think these things are quite interesting and exciting to watch, but if you don't know what's going on, you don't know what's going on. So I think they're doing the right thing. They just need to broadcast it maybe slightly better.
So what have you been doing since the British GT ended?
I have been basically, because I'm doing 2 programs this year, British GT and F1 eSports, for 2 different parties. I'm doing basically prep for F1 eSports, the final event. So it's not gone too well this year, if I'm honest. I think a lot of energy's been spent, obviously, focusing on the real life thing. And it does take up a lot of energy. But yeah, as well as that, keeping fit, keeping sharp, obviously, because I don't plan on that being my final race in real racing. So looking ahead to 2021, putting things in place from a commercial point of view and everything like that. Just prepping for 2021 has been a big part of it. But F1 eSports, until that's over, that is the primary focus, really.
Do you feel like they're two predominantly different disciplines, the real life motorsport and the sim racing? Do they require their own kind of preparation that's mutually exclusive between them?
Well, they're definitely different. I think if I was doing ACC and British GT, it'd be a bit easier because they are similar car, similar driving style, albeit one's real, one's virtual. F1 eSports, F1 the game is a bit simcadey. I think that's fair to say. So it's not realistic completely. So you do have to do weird things to be fast. The amount of hours needed to be on the pace is insane. Like, I think the game came out in July, and I've put 390 hours into it or something like that. So it's absolutely insane. But it's still a challenge, a driving challenge to to try and beat the best on that game is near on impossible. So I like trying to strive for perfection, even if it's not going well so far. I'm improving, and hopefully I'll have a really good final event.
Fingers crossed for you. It's a very interesting one that I'd like to circle back around to later on when we start talking about the sim racing physics. But for the time being, I mean, to the newer viewers who may have been living under a rock for the last couple of years, can you give us a rundown of your racing past, how you got into esports, and essentially how you became so dominant at them, I guess, outside of this year?
So in 20, I'll measure stuff from the top. I started karting at the age of 8 in real life. So stopped it about when I was 16. Went into Formula Ford in the UK for 2 races, then completely ran out of money. All funded by my mum and dad, which is, I'm really grateful for. And then had 2 years completely away from anything driving related. So I went to work in engineering, and then I picked up a cheap rig in 2017. And just played the first Project Cars game, just from a casual point of view, just to kind of fill the void of not racing anymore. And then low-level racing esports started to emerge. So Project Cars 2 came out. There was a bit of low-level esports on that, and I ended up winning a competition that won me €4,000. And it went from there, really. Just won another competition on Project Cars 2, then E-Rock, which was on Assetto Corsa. So the Race of Champions hosted their own esports event, flew us out to Mexico, won that. Le Mans Esports hosted one on Forza, won that. And then World's Fastest Gamer came about and won that. So that was kind of my journey from 2017 to 2019.
Imagine that, motorsport's actually earning you money rather than costing it. What a great thing that you fell into there.
Yeah. If you asked me 3 years ago, would any of that be possible, I would have said no. But it's one of those things that one thing leads to another, and you just kind of at the end of the year, you look back and go, "Wow, that was one hell of a journey, really."
What's fascinating is how quickly it developed for you, because you and I seems like we got into sim racing around about the same time. I was a late bloomer, as well, as they call it, because I only started sim racing in my late 20s just for fun, and it kind of spiraled into this strange little channel. But it's amazing to see how short the span of time is between someone completely starting in the discipline and becoming essentially top tier world class at it. But I would imagine that you've invested, several thousands of hours into that discipline to get to that level.
Yeah. I mean, to start with, I wasn't really. But I think, like any craft, to be really good, you have to put. They say it's like 10,000 hours, don't they? But I dread to think how many hours I've had sat on a simulator in the last few years. I'm sure it's the majority rather than the minority. But in my eyes, it's 100% been worth it. And I think 2018 was when I was grinding quite a lot to try and figure out how to be quick on a simulator full stop, no matter what game it was. And then when I joined Veloce Esports in 2018, I think probably the first esports team in racing to really take it to that next level of seriousness. They said to me, "Look, you've got a decent amount of talent to try and go to every game and try and win on every game, because no one's really done that yet. So that's what I did to start with. I think the level in sim racing's gone up a hell of a lot in the last year. So I'd say my sim form is not where I'd like it to be. 2019 was really good, but 2020, I've made mistakes. I've not been as quick as I'd like to be in certain areas. So I've got a lot of improvement to do in my eyes in the sim world. The real world this year's gone really well. But the level's going up every day, I think.
That's great. And once you get back up to pace, if I were to pay you enough money, would you teach me the ways of the aliens?
Never say never. Money talks, as they say.
How do you feel, we're circling back to real life motorsport now, how do you feel about your maiden drive, which was originally intended to be the GT World Challenge, essentially being changed to the British GT because of the pandemic situation? Were you a little disappointed at perhaps the lowering of prestige, or were you happy at the fact that the stakes were sure to be a little bit lower?
I think it was a blessing in disguise, because in British GT, I wouldn't say it's easier, but the level is probably a little bit lower because there's less cars, there's less pros. But at the same time, the tracks bite harder because they're more narrow, less runoff. It rains more in the UK, compared to Europe usually. So there was that particular challenge. I think I wouldn't have been competing for wins and poles in GT World Challenge. So I think it was a good thing. I think I learned a hell of a lot more in the British Championship than I would have in Europe. And it gives me somewhere to go as well. I think there's a natural progression there to go to Europe. That's where I want to be next year, with the same team, the same car, with World's Fastest Gamer, to do it again and try and compete at the top end of Europe. So I think, initially, I think I was a bit, that's a bit of a shame. My big chance in Europe's been downgraded to a British Championship, but it was a bit of a blessing.
It's a great way to look at it. The glass is always half full, as they say, should you choose to see it that way.
Yeah. But to be fair, to start with, it wasn't, but yeah.
Sure. So what I'm actually really curious about, even after all the talk that you've done comparing sim racing to real racing, is when it really came down to it and you were on that full grid starting and the lights went green at Alton Park and you're heading down towards T1 for the first time, what's going through your head at this point?
Well, I mean, mental preparation is very important in any form of racing, but I think I prepared myself in a way where I wasn't really thinking about anything. I think that's the best way to be, to perform in any sport or eSport, just to be subconscious. I'd done my procedures on the warm-up lap. Everything was ready, and then coming through the final corner, I knew that it's completely up to me now. There's nothing, no procedures I need to do. It's simply me in the car. How quick can I get, through turn one without colliding into anyone else? And it was a bit cautious. My first corner, I let the guy on the inside go, but I was really, really hammered down to just hold position, don't make any contact, just do a solid stint. And to be fair to you, it wasn't as daunting as I thought it'd be. I think the car control and the pace was clearly there. The only difference was it was in reality, and there was actual people round Alton Park watching me do it. So I think once you get over those nerves, and nerves are a good thing. I think they show you're alive, you want it. If you can handle those nerves, which I managed to do on that day, it wasn't as daunting as I thought it'd be.
So is it fair to say that you would have been a little bit torn between the team orders to simply slot into the caravan and follow the leader to minimize the chance of destroying Jenson's car, and maybe your innate desire as a winner to just go for the moves and constantly vie for position? Because I remember you were stuck behind a McLaren for a little while there and getting a little bit frustrated by it.
A little bit. That was a really good problem at the time to have, to know that I was quicker than the guys in front. It's my first race. There was a part of me thinking, well, I'm just going to drop back here and fall back through the pack. But it's very easy to think, sat in my rig before this thing, oh yeah, they can say what they want. I'm going to go into turn one and send it and show what I'm all about. You get there, you're sat in a McLaren, which is worth £500,000 or whatever. Your thinking changes slightly. And I think the key thing is to be calm and do what feels right at the time. And at the time, it just didn't feel right to send it around the outside of turn one. If I sent it onto the grass, into the barrier, could you imagine how much of a fool I would have looked and how much of a bad thing that would have been for sim racing? So it's, you got to keep your head screwed on in those times, really.
I think you did all the right things, mate. I mean, I'm getting a very, very small microcosm of that experience. I've recently been kidnapped by Team Butler Pal Motorsports, who are guys that are a far, far higher level than I am. And it's every single race we do together, it's like, don't ruin the race for the team, Erman. Don't ruin the race for the team, Erman. So like the entire way through, I'm not making any defensive moves. I'm just kind of like holding the line and being like, I hope I get through this. So I can't even imagine what that's like in real life with a, £500,000 car at stake. So props to you for doing what you did and actually ending up positioning it so well and qualifying at pole so many times as well.
Yeah, that was surprising. I'd say qualifying is probably a weakness of mine, or has been. But in the real car, it wasn't. We had a really good qualifying form all year, really. I think, obviously, the first one didn't get the pole from the track limits issue. And it was so fine as well. I couldn't believe we got nabbed of that pole. But Michael as well, my teammate, Michael O'Brien, he did a great job. Qualifying's not just up to me, it's up to him as well. And we both delivered laps very close to each other. And I think that was the key for us all year, was because we were so close. Other teams weren't. They'd have one quick and one slower. And we managed to get pole, sometimes very fine margins, but unfortunately we didn't convert any of them into a race win, which was really annoying. We won the first race, starting fourth, but all of those poles didn't convert into a race win. I think it was more bad luck than anything else. But yeah.
There are so many factors in motorsport. I mean, it really, starting in pole is just one part of the equation. But I'm still trying to get over the novelty of someone who has so many world record hot laps in F1 2019 telling me that he thinks he's poor at qualifying. So it's quite a place to be.
Yeah, it's different. Hot lapping's different to qualifying, though, isn't it? You got to deliver there and then, no mistakes. And as I say, the level's going up in sim racing. It's hard to stay with those guys at the top. F1 eSports has kind of exposed me for, maybe I've not been putting in the effort, or the effort required compared to some others. It's not as if I've just been sat there watching TV, but when you're doing the real life stuff, it's hard to balance both. So yeah.
So going back to when you raced at Brands Hatch, the safety car came out and diminished what seemed to be a half-minute lead you'd established in that race. We've already spoken about success penalties and all that, though I can't remember if that was off or on camera, but how do you feel about elements such as that being such an integral part of GT racing?
It's racing in general, isn't it? That Land Rover incident was it was very unlucky. But effectively, I came into the pits, safety car came out, so my 30-second lead got reduced to nothing, but even still, we were in the lead. And we should have come out in the lead. The pit stop, basically I stopped, Michael got in, the team did the tyres and the fuel, and the Land Rover that was helping the car out and track came into the pit lane, a live pit lane, and just got in the way of our car, so we couldn't get out. And it cost us like 2 or 3 seconds, and then after that we lost the lead. So, and then Brands Hatch is quite hard to overtake, so we didn't get the lead back, and we finished second, which is still a good result. But we should have won that race. We should have won Donington as well, but we had a little bit of a brake issue, so we started slowing down and falling back through the pack. And ultimately, those two things cost us a real chance of winning the championship. So. I do think we could have won this year if things went our way, but sometimes they just don't go your way.
Do you think we should see a bit more retrospective checks and balances done in motorsport events to kind of account for situations and incidents like that do unfairly cost teams their races? Do you think that should be something that the stewards and the governing organisations should put more of a look into?
British GT definitely looked into it. You can't penalise someone else because someone else got unfairly done, though. That's the thing. So Barwell won the race. You can't go and penalise Barwell because we've had an issue. It doesn't really make sense. So I think it's just one of those things. It happens in all walks of life, in sport. Unfortunate things do happen. But hopefully there is a nice balance, and maybe if I race again next year, we'll have a bit more good luck.
Oh, fingers crossed. And circling back to what you said about qualifying, what do you think are the key differences between real and simulated qualifying?
Tyre preparation's more important and more volatile in real life. So you got to really know what you're doing and really do it well. And if you get compromised, so say, for example, if you get held up before you start your lap and you end up starting the lap on cool tyres, cool brakes, you really feel it. Whereas on the sim, it's not so much. It's not so important. I I think the general mentality is very similar. I think the same things before going into a lap. I'm subconscious, hopefully, if I'm doing a good lap in both the sim and in real life. And tyre drop off as well is more noticeable in real life as well. So, say you're on your third qualifying lap in a row in GTs. In real life, towards the end of the third lap, you really start to notice that tyre drop off, whereas in the sim, it's not so prominent. So, yeah, I'd say it's not actually that dissimilar. It's very similar. It's just tyres in real life do behave a lot differently compared to the sim.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of technical factors we haven't really quite gotten into modeling in utmost detail yet, but who knows what might happen over the next 10 years or so.
Yeah.
Let's circle back to what you said about the wet weather experience. Now, let's talk about that first race at Donington. Obviously, the experience of wet weather driving is very different between real life and the sims. How much did you learn about wet weather driving from the real life experience? And based on that knowledge, do you think there's any simulator out there which can actually prepare someone for it?
It's actually a question I've not really been asked so much, so I can really give a proper, honest answer as to what happened for me to not be on the pace. So basically, I'd driven karts in the wet, on slicks, on wets. I was always really good in the wet in whatever I did. Same thing on the Sims. So not all the Sims have wet physics, but whenever they did, I was always really, really quick in the wet. F1 2020, F1 2019, I've always been really quick in the wet and intermediate conditions. So I got in the car at Donington. I'd never driven the car in the wet at all. Handful of hours in it in the dry. My first laps were in halfway through a race, which we were, I think we were in third position. So I went out on track, no warm up, no nothing, just experimenting in the middle of a race. And I was up against, on that particular weekend, I out-qualified Michael, so I was on track with the pros. So Phil Keane, Caldarelli, Kajala, all of these top GT drivers in all the manufacturer cars. And that made me look a lot worse than I probably was doing. They knew exactly what they were doing. They'd been around the track, they'd been around in the wet, they'd been around in those cars before in the wet. It was all up against me, and it made me look really, really bad. My main issue from a driving point of view was I was driving the GT car in the wet like I'd drive in the wet on F1 2020 because I'd obviously been practicing F1 eSports, and naturally a bit of wet driving was involved with that as well. So what I was doing was short shifting to minimize wheel spin. I was braking, going into a corner and going down the gears really late and fast. So basically minimizing the revs so it wouldn't lock any of the axles under braking. Turns out you don't drive a GT car in the wet like that at all. That's completely wrong. What you want to do is use the engine braking as much as possible, so you don't have to go on the brakes as much. You want to not short shift because there's TC in a GT car, so that TC kicks in, stops you getting wheel spin, and you don't have to worry about that. And what I was doing was just killing all the torque out of the engine and just going or coming at the corners really slow. So all those combination of things resulted in me being really off the pace. I got quicker throughout the day, but still left the day thinking, wow, I'm really, really bad in the wet. But yeah, it wasn't the case. When I got to Snetterton, it was kind of resolved, really.
That's awesome. And it's cool to hear that perspective as well, because you only get the newscasts and the little highlight reels when you're watching it as a spectator. So it's always nice to know what happened from the inside of the garage, as it were. So thanks for sharing that with us. You were looking really strong for the British GT Championship title for a while there. Where do you think it started to slide downward for you guys?
Snetterton, definitely. I think before Snetterton, after Donington, we had a podium. We should have won the race, I think, but we had a podium right up there. 3 races left, 2 rounds left. If Snetterton was dry, I think we had a good shot of being up the front again, competing for podiums and whatever. But in the wet, obviously, it took me a while to get up to speed in the wet. But come Snetterton, I was on pace in the wet relative to Michael, and Michael is a proven entity in the wet in GT4. He was always quick in the wet. I was just as quick as him in the wet in the GT3 at Snetterton. And it was more of a fundamental car issue in the wet, whether it was ourselves setting up the car incorrectly, if it's just the McLaren in the wet, who knows? It could be a mixture of both. But whatever the reason, we weren't quick in the wet at Snetterton. We were at the end of the second race, but by then it's a bit too late. So I think we did figure it out. Just again, a bit too late, and we had a very, very, very limited testing schedule throughout the whole season. I did one test at Paul Ricard before lockdown in March or April, and we did no testing throughout the whole season in British GT. So, and I can tell you for free, other teams were. And you're up against it. There's no question about it. It doesn't matter how good you are. If all these other drivers in the championship are very good. So if they're testing and you're not, you're automatically up against it. But that's how it is. And I honestly think we did the best we could. But the Lambo, the Merc in the wet, for whatever reason, I think it was they just knew the car better. Were just rapid in the wet, and it cost us at Snetterton and Silverstone. We still had a shot at the championship, but it was a very outside chance. So, yeah.
Do you think it's that lack of testing that essentially impacted Jenson when he raced with you guys at Silverstone for the very last round? Was it just not enough time in the car?
I think it's probably easier for Jenson than myself because Jenson is coming down from what is Formula One. It must have felt quite slow to him, whereas to me it felt ballistic. But I think, to be honest, there was some fundamental car issues with Jenson and Chris's car that cost them a lot of lap time throughout the weekend. So I don't think it's a fair reflection to say that we had equal cars. I think there were some differences. But yeah, not testing for Jenson. I think they did one test, but we were more experienced in the car. We were more comfortable in the car. They were still figuring stuff out on the fly during the race. They had so little testing. So it was Jenson's first time driving ABS as well. So all those things were new to him. I can't believe that's his first time in an ABS car, or given the amount of driving he's done over the years.
It's unbelievable. I remember watching the highlight reel and him talking about it. I'm just like, what? Like, how do you not have it in a road car or something? How have you not locked the ABS at some point in your life? You're an F1 world champion. But it's insane to think. Like, he comes from a different school of driving. Less assists, a lot more like intrinsic driver ability required to keep that car doing what it's supposed to be doing. And there's a lot to respect about that as well.
Yeah, but there were bits and pieces I learned from him as well, even from that one weekend. His tyre warm-up procedure, the way he goes out on a very cold practice session and gets heat into the brakes and the tyres. He knew what he was doing. You could clearly see that from the onboards. So there was bits like that I took away from him. Certain corners, he was really, really quick as well from his driving style. But yeah, it's really funny actually, because me, Chris, Michael and Jenson all had very different styles. It was interesting to kind of take little bits from someone and maybe help someone in a certain area. It was very interesting, especially the debriefs throughout that whole weekend, really.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see. And essentially what you're talking about with the testing being quite limited, I feel like that's something that people from the sim racing scene really take for granted, is essentially the theoretically infinite practice sessions and testing and strategizing. Do you think that sim racing should put a greater focus on emulating the limitations placed upon real drivers and teams in motorsports, such as limited qualifying runs, the true cost of making mistakes or damaging the car, and limiting how much practice and setup time someone can actually get prior to doing a competition?
I think they do a bit of that already. For example, Donington, no one could test at the track the week of the event. So there's little bits like that, but you're right, there's still advantages for people with money, but I think there's always going to be, because if they can afford to test, teams are not going to say no. Who's going to regulate them to not test? I mean, it's in no one's interest to do that. So money will always give you that advantage, I think, naturally, but it's not essential to have a full testing program. If as I said earlier, if luck went our way, I think we could have won the championship. So I don't think it was essential for us to go testing. I don't think we would have found half a second a lap, but it would have been more comfortable at the race weekends, driving, knowing where the limit of the car is. Where it was Alton Park, for example, it was a bit of, is the car going to spin here? Is it going to grip? I don't know. So it would have been more comfortable for sure.
And did you find yourself putting time in on the simulator leading up to the events you faced in the British GT, or did you feel it was so irrelevant to the real life experience that it didn't really matter?
No, I put lots of hours of preparation in ACC, especially. I tried to make it as realistic as possible, so using VR to get the immersive looking into a corner aspect, running the graphics as realistic as possible, turning the force feedback or tuning it to a way that felt like the McLaren. Fortunately, I have that kind of memory from actually driving the real car, how that would feel. Making the brake pedal really, really stiff and hard. Just making everything as realistic as possible. Wearing my boots, wearing my gloves. And fortunately, on ACC, the tracks are laser scanned so well, so are the cars, that it's really realistic practice. So the only thing I can't really prepare for is the wet, because the wet physics, unfortunately, are not there. I think that's pretty clear to see. But in the dry, I'd get there on the Friday or the Saturday and go out for practice in the real thing, and I'd feel like I've already done it before. So it really, really did help.
One of the best things about preparing in simulators, I remember when I got to the Nordschleife in the real life for the first time, I felt like I'd been there thousands of times before, but I consciously knew that I hadn't, and it was the biggest cognitive dissonance experience I've ever had in my life. The only thing that was... It was like going through the corners I've done thousands and thousands of times, but I'd never felt the actual corresponding G-forces. So it was this very surreal moment where it all hit me all at once. It gets quite interesting and emotional. Did you ever find it hit you that way? Like, let's say when you did Brands Hatch for the first time and you actually kind of felt it in a GT3 car, was that kind of hitting you in a very like visceral, almost personal way?
To be honest, there's so many other things you're thinking about, like just doing things right and thinking, bloody hell, this is fast.
Yeah.
You don't really have time to reflect and think, oh, this is so amazing. It looks like ACC.
Yeah.
But when you look back at it, it does. You know, ACC, in terms of GT3, is the game to go to. And I think they're always improving it. They're always, you know, bringing in DLCs and updating the game. So I think they're really leading that realism in terms of the sim side of things. I think, you know, people have the argument that rFactor 2 is more realistic. And I think if the track mod and the car mod is right, I think there's a good argument for that. But yeah, ACC at the moment is definitely my favourite sim.
I think you'll find a lot of very smug viewers in my comments section after this, because I'm renowned as the rFactor 2 propagandist in the scene. They'll be like, see, we told you, Ermin, it was always ACC. It's one of those funny things where I find that like what each game gets wrong, the other one gets right. And we're in this beautiful kind of place where like once they meet in the middle, we're going to have this almost idyllic GT simulator that's going to be so glorious to drive in. But I completely see why you would say that ACC is the more realistic experience for preparing you for real-life GT driving. And of course, you would know far better than I ever would. So I'm happy to go along with that.
There is the argument that Rudy Van Buren, for example, thinks rFactor 2 is. So he's also driving in real life in Porsches. So I think it is subject to opinion, but I feel like my opinion's pretty accurate.
No, it's, you know, after I got out of my first very, I guess, mid to high level event, the 24 hours of Nürburgring that we did a few weeks ago, I was inundated with that sensation of, okay, so this is what the aliens are doing. It delineates from real life driving procedure, and they end up basically just throwing the car into the corner and sliding it through to make up for those tenths. And it's like, okay, you probably wouldn't do that in a 24-hour endurance race. Then I went straight back to ACC after that, and the car felt connected. It felt like really weighty and damped at high speed. And I'm like,
yeah.
Maybe I was incorrect about some things. But it's one of those things where I know that both devs are so dialed into this. They're so keen to have the most realistic experiences that I can't help but wish both of them the best, whether it be Kunos or Studio 397. And of course, you know, with the guys at BPM being really nice to me, the fact that I'm a bit more tied into the rFactor 2 development schedule, I know what they have planned. I'm just really keen to see whether they can tie in those last little exploits in the physics. And likewise with ACC, I'm glad that they're always getting onto things such as patching one of the recent exploits they had, where I think some of the aliens were overinflating the tires to get past the rolling resistance and then jacking up the downforce on the car in order to make up for that and get the grip back.
Yeah, there's always. I think there will always be little quirks like that in any game because it's not real life. But you're right; they're both striving. I think they're probably the lead two sims. I think it's fair to say at the moment, rFactor 2 and ACC. rFactor 2 simply because it's so free range. There's so many. You can do whatever you want basically, any car, any track. But ACC. It's my preference. But you're right; they're both doing a great job in leading and changing the game to suit and make it more realistic.
This is one of those things I can see it resulting in massive arguments in the paddock between you and Jenson because he's such an rFactor 2 guy and you're an ACC guy. Does this result in like near fisticuffs?
Oh yeah, just massive fight in the middle of the paddock.
Yeah,
no,
so totally
I think
matters.
he likes ACC as well. I haven't asked him to be fair, but whatever he's doing it really well because really, really quick. And I think he's got a pretty decent setup at home as well. A direct drive. I think he has a sim cube, widescreen monitor, Heusinkveld pedals. So I mean, yeah, he's got all the kit.
Great. Maybe I'll ask him when he schools me tomorrow in the Spa race. So tying that into everything, how do you feel about the setup and driving exploits which go hand in hand in top tier esports? I've spoken about the stuff that I discovered myself, but do you think that the simulators should make it a priority to get their physics as close to real life as possible? Should that be number one?
Yeah, I have an interesting take on the esports stuff. Really, I think my personal point of view with F1 esports, for example, I think the only reason I'm not the biggest fan of it is because you have to put so many hours in, an unhealthy amount of hours in. And I think the only reason you have to put that many hours in is because you're developing the setup, and the setup development isn't logical at all. As you say, there's quirks. I remember in F1 2019, to be in the wet, or have the quickest setup, usually you'd have to run the ride height really, really, really high, and sometimes even negative rake. So bizarre things like that.
Yep.
That it would never be the case in real life. But you've got to find these things, you've got to test them, you've got to make sure it's quicker, combine it with another setup change, and that's so time consuming. That's where all the time is spent. So I think, me personally, I'd love to see these things go default setup, just so it's a case of the driver practices, is as quick as possible, and whoever wins, is more than likely the person that's the quickest driver, not the person with the quickest setup. So that's my take on it, really. I think it'd be a more enjoyable, more sustainable thing to do, because you wouldn't have to spend 300 plus hours in the space of a couple of months to be quick. But in terms of the quirks, and as I said earlier, I think they'll always be there. I think games like F1 and Gran Turismo, for example, can do a better job to make it more realistic. But maybe that's not their target. Maybe their target is to make a enjoyable, easy pick up to play game for the mass market. And I think you can't have it all.
There's a lot to be said for both approaches, and I think commercial success and success within a niche market are usually very much at odds with one another. So a sim has probably got to define for itself whether it wants to be the most authentic driving experience or whether it wants to be more of a mass market sort of a thing. But I think there's a lot to be said about what you explained regarding locked off setups. That's something I see in the team a lot. There's a lot of guys that would just like to get on with the act of actually racing. And certainly for me, looking at when the team sent me my setup for the Ferrari 488 I'll be racing in the race tomorrow, I was basically just holding my head in my hands going, this can't be right. This can't be what it is that's achieving the best times in rFactor right now. So I have to kind of recalibrate the way that I see things after doing this at a higher level. So it's an interesting place that we find ourselves in. I think we all have a vested interest in seeing the physics improve and get to a point that makes a little bit more sense. I think probably when you look at the sim racing scene, there's a lot of, let's call it tribalism. There's a lot of people that are very passionate about their particular sim. I think the more that we open ourselves up about developing everything in tandem together, probably the better of a state that the scene will be in come 10 years' time.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, when you compare it to other games, like FIFA, there's only really FIFA, and that's their community and their audience, whereas same with Call of Duty as well. But with racing esports, there's so many games, so many sims, it's so fragmented. It's like an internal battle rather than let's try and make it better and show it to the whole world. I think there's an argument, having all these sims is a good thing because some are different, some are better, some are worse, some are easier to pick up and play. But it'd be really nice just to have one game, one sim that's realistic, easy to pick up and play, had everything. I think it'd be so much better for everyone. So, but I don't think that's ever going to happen, really.
We can but hope, right? Do you see yourself doing more sim racing or real life motorsport stuff in the future, or keeping it as an even split between both?
Well, ideally, I'd love to keep it an even split like this year, but it's. I mean, I can guarantee you right now I'll be doing a lot of sim racing in the future because I can. I don't have to spend thousands and thousands of pounds to do it. But in the real world, it really isn't in my hands. Obviously, getting the best results possible and representing a brand as best as I can is in my hands, and I've tried to been doing as well as I can in that department. I think in motorsport you've got to be exceptional to stay in it, let alone do well in it. Because if you're just doing a solid job, you'll get forgotten about very quickly. But if I can, do the right things and attract the right people and whatever, I'm sure I can try my best to stay in motorsport. And if it was down to my pace and stuff, I would literally say to you right now, I plan on being in motorsport for a long time, but it's not just completely down to that, unfortunately. So we'll wait and see.
You're treading on fairly new ground here, and it's always interesting to see what new trajectory your career takes. So definitely keep us surprised through your channel. To anyone that doesn't know, it's
Yes.
James with how many A's?
A. 8? Well, I just had a complete brain meltdown there. There's 3 A's.
3 A's, gotcha. I was like, 8 A's, that's very poetic. Nice of you. Great. So yeah, definitely keep us surprised. But, rounding out this to the end, essentially, I know that we can't all be 100% dialed in at all times. What do you do to get away from motorsports for a bit? Or are you one of those obsessives that kind of keeps every waking moment in front of the simulator?
Nah, I'm not that guy, to be honest. I need my time away from it. I'm one of those people that, for example, I think there's 2 types of people in sim racing. I think there's grinders and I think there's drivers, shall I say. I don't know how to phrase it without sounding like an absolute tool, but some people play a sim for 10 hours straight and get quicker and quicker and quicker and quicker, whereas I get quicker for the first 2 hours, then I start to slow down, so I need a break. I come back, I'll be quicker, but then I start to slow down again. I need a break. So I've got to manage that. I'd love to have the mentality of if I just keep on playing more and more and more, I get quicker, but it's just not how I work. It starts to get, after a few hours, a bit robotic, this isn't even driving anymore. This is like just movements. I like to, hang out with friends, obviously not at the moment because of COVID, but just play a bit of football from time to time, do some gym work, do all sorts, hang out with my girlfriend. There's all sorts I like to do away from the sim rig and away from the racing. So, yeah, I keep myself busy.
What you're describing is a phenomenon that's very well documented. I remember back when I used to practice guitar for 6 hours a day, I would read the articles saying that, hey, after 40 minutes, you basically just start hitting massive diminishing returns and you're not really learning or retaining anything. So there's a lot to be said about taking frequent breaks, I think, no matter what you do. Unfortunately, I am just born and bred to be one of the aforementioned grinders that you referred to. So even if I'm getting no benefit at all, I'm going to sit here for 12 hours just sweating it out until my entire body aches on the sim rig. Whether or not I'm like duking it out for split 8 or something equally pathetic, something about that experience of suffering through the sim racing is what really appeals to me. But, different strokes for different folks, right? And certainly your methodology can't be argued with.
No, yeah, I've only figured it out recently as well. It's really important to understand how you operate, how to get the best out of yourself. And not everyone's the same. So if you think, because matey boy over here does this, I'm going to copy him. You can to an extent, but it might not work for you. So,
yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time tonight, James. Is there anything you want to leave the folks at home with?
No, just thanks for listening. I hope maybe it's inspired someone to do sim racing, or I'd keep an eye out if you're interested to go into the real world. To keep an eye out for those competitions like World's Fastest Game or any equivalent, because there's every chance it could be you competing in it. So yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for being on the program, James.
No, thank you, Ermin.
Guys, that was James Baldwin, world's fastest gamer, real-life GT3 driver, driving extraordinaire, and we've yet to see what else. We'll see you next time.